The next 2 weeks in our New Testament reading covers the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy. And so just to make things neat and orderly, we'll talk about all of 1st Timothy this week, and then next week talk exclusively about 2nd Timothy. So let's jump in and see what we find in this first letter. In the first few verses, Paul, who is writing this, says that he instructed Timothy to remain on at Ephesus. And so we want to have a little bit of background about the characters involved. We remember Paul traveled around the Roman Empire, and on his second journey, he called a young man named Timothy to join him on these journeys. And this was a young man that had a good reputation of being someone who was knowledgeable and strong in faith. And so he began to travel with Paul. And so we see here in the first verses of 1 Timothy that Paul is entrusting Timothy with a great task here to stay on his own and to take the responsibility to teach the gospel in Ephesus, and particularly to give instruction to the church that is meeting in Ephesus. And that verse actually, the specific instruction is to teach people not to teach false doctrine. That is a big piece of this letter that we don't want to miss. In chapter 1, Paul addresses men that have strayed from the faith and how they should be thought of and how they should be handled. In chapter 4, he will begin by talking about those whom the Spirit expressly says will teach false doctrines about various things. And then even in chapter 6, he will come back to talking about those who, for love of money, will teach a different gospel. And Timothy needs to be warned about these people. And as someone who has been entrusted with the charge of teaching and instructing Christians in the city of Ephesus, he needs to know how to handle these type of false teachers. Okay, well, that then shows us one of the purposes that Paul has for Timothy, which relates to his instruction of the church in Ephesus. He says in chapter 3, verse 15, that he is writing these things so that one would know how to conduct himself in the household of God, which by that he means the church of God. Okay, so that explains a lot of the content in 1 Timothy. In chapter 2, Paul will deal with the roles of men and women respectively in the church. In chapter 3, he will talk about the qualifications for those who will be serving in the particular offices of elders and deacons that will serve the church in that capacity. In chapter 5, he talks about how a church would take on, in a benevolent way, the support of widows, but how there are some particular instructions to that regard, and even instructions in chapter 5 about elders and how elders should be treated by the church. And Timothy is charged with giving these instructions and, in essence, carrying out these instructions in the church there at Ephesus. But that's not the only thing that Paul is instructing Timothy to do, emphasizing to Timothy in the letter. He is also telling him to look at himself. The most famous, maybe, verse in 1 Timothy here in chapter 4, let no one look down on you for your youth, but instead show yourself to be an example. Paul says you need to look at yourself. Later on in that chapter, he'll say, pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Someone like Timothy, who is charged with not only the preaching of the gospel, but the teaching of these instructions that Christians needed to pay attention to in the church, it is all the more important that he himself as an individual would be pure, would be holy, would be disciplined, would be focused on the Word of God, meditating on it, devoting himself to that, and make sure that you are fighting the good fight. And that's where this starts. And for any of us who are teachers, or any of us who hope to have any kind of influence on others, we cannot lose sight of this, that yes, we are being instructed to instruct others, but we can't do that until we first are devoting ourselves to godliness, disciplining ourselves, fleeing temptation ourselves, and that's where this starts. So for Timothy, we find in this letter a really nice mix of personal exhortation to be the kind of Christian we need to be, as well as helpful examples for how we are, as Christians, to order our churches, how we are to conduct ourselves in the church. Check back next week for our video on 2 Timothy, but for now, I hope you enjoy your week of Bible reading. Thank you.